Hey everyone. One of the points I made in the last video regarding racism in the criminal justice system was that race is not, in fact, a biological construction. It is based on the assumption of biology, but it is not derived from biology itself. A different way of putting this is that race is a social construct. And while it doesn't exist as a real thing in terms of biology, it is real in its consequences. So what I'm going to do in this video, this part 2, is I'm going to discuss what some of those consequences are, and particularly I'm going to be examining the criminal justice system. What we're going to start is we're going to start with the ideological aspect of racism, which is a part of the racism that we see more broadly in the criminal justice system. And what that means is that I'm going to be focusing on some phenomena that social scientists have variously called implicit bias, a related phenomena, which is stereotypes. That should not be the first time you've heard that term, prejudice. And then from there, we're going to move up into actively observable forms of discrimination. For starters, I want to look at some research that was published in 2012 in the journal Criminology. This research looked at people's perceptions of Black folks. Specifically, the researchers asked randomly selected participants from the US to think about 5 different types of crime, and then guess what percentage of these crimes are committed by Blacks. Crimes included violence, burglaries, robbing people at gunpoint, selling illegal drugs, and general crime committed by juveniles. In every instance, respondents overestimated the involvement of Blacks. They also found that white participants who believed a large percentage of their neighbors were Black tended to believe they were at higher risk of becoming victims. Similarly, those whites who reported that the number of Blacks in their neighborhood increased in the past 5 years tended to believe they were at a higher risk of becoming victims. What's interesting about this research is that this is asking people to talk openly about ideas that they have about race. And as you may know, people are often reluctant to talk openly about their ideas of race because most of us have the sense that talking about having different expectations for Blacks, especially as it relates to crime, than we do for whites, is not really the politically correct thing to say. We might be called racist, in fact, for espousing those views, but in fact, even when asking people to talk openly about it, this research suggests that people were still willing to share the idea that they were confident enough to share the idea that they thought Blacks were more likely to commit these crimes. If we look at some research published in 2014 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, here researchers asked, why is it that Black children in the US are 18 times more likely than white children to be sentenced as adults, and Black children represent 58% of all children sentenced to adult facilities? Part of the answer appears to be that people tend to overestimate the age of Black children, and they regard them as more culpable. In the study, researchers asked participants to think about children within a criminal justice context in order to examine whether people's perceptions of innocence differed depending on the race of a child suspect, Black, Latinx, or white, and also whether perceptions of innocence would vary on the severity of the crime, misdemeanors, or felonies. The researchers observed that people's perception of a child's innocence was closely related to how old they estimated the child to be. So they wanted to know whether participants overestimated the ages of Black children. Sure enough, as you can see, people tended to overestimate the age of Black children, and they overestimated the age of Black felony suspects to a greater degree than that of Black misdemeanor suspects. Separately, the researchers tried to assess whether people believed Black and Latinx children were more culpable than white children by asking, how responsible is he for his own action? How much can he care for himself? How likely is he to persist in these negative behaviors? And how likely is it that he did not intend the negative consequences of his actions? The researchers found that Blacks were rated as more culpable than Latinos, and Latinos were rated as more culpable than whites. The point being that our implicit biases are informing or otherwise wrapped up with our stereotypes, and both our biases and our stereotypes inform our prejudices, and our prejudices inform how we act in the world. And in fact, what I'm going to look at in the next few slides is how people discriminate, people who have power within the criminal justice system, how they discriminate against Black and brown folks as compared to whites. During these last couple of weeks, I've asked all of you to read Michelle Alexander's important book, The New Jim Crow. And in that book, she makes the case very persuasively, to my mind, that drug arrest rates are different for Blacks and whites. And that specific statistic is incredibly important to look at because it was in fact the war on drugs, which is the jumping off point for huge disparities that we see in incarceration rates. And so as you can see in this chart, which pools data from 1972 to 2011, looking at rates, that is arrests per 100,000, so it's all relative, even though Blacks comprise a smaller share of the population than do whites. And you can see when we break it down in rates that Blacks are arrested for drugs in far higher numbers than for whites. So the first type of discrimination I want to look at, and perhaps the most controversial, is the police use of force and whether implicit biases, stereotypes, and these ideological factors actually play a role in a discriminatory use of force by killing or injuring Black and brown suspects at higher rates than whites. The data on this are legion. If one sorts through the data, I think that the evidence is very convincing in making the case that police officers in the United States commit more violence, lethal or otherwise, against Black and brown suspects than they do white suspects. In one journal article published in the journal Nature, researchers looked at responses to 1.2 million 911 emergency calls in a US city and plotted the use of force by officers who responded to those calls, and they broke it up by whether the officers were Black or white. Now, as you can see in the chart, white officers tended to use force more in Black communities, but what's important to note here is that there was an increase in the use of force among Black officers as well. A more straightforward chart showing that officers have a bias towards Black and brown folks as compared to white folks is this chart, where it shows that Blacks were the victims of excessive use of force in the majority of substantiated cases in New York City. And you can see that Blacks had 57.8% of all incidents that had the use of force. And this is important because Blacks in New York City only constitute 22.6% of the population. The criminal justice system as a whole, though, is working to systematically discriminate against Black and brown folks. And so if we leave behind the moment of contact between suspects and officer and move into the courtroom a little bit, you can see that plea bargains are less generous for Blacks than they are for whites. In this chart from 2018 research, you can see at the top in panel A is looking at misdemeanor cases, and in panel B, it's looking at felony cases. And each of those rows is broken down by white and Black. And you can see that the top charge dropped or amended in misdemeanor cases. That occurred for 63.99% of whites, where it only occurred for 48.09% of Blacks. As Michelle Alexander points out, the war on drugs is somewhat of a unique initiative in the history of policing in the United States. And the reason for this is that unlike other types of crime, it requires police to be proactive. They have to go out and find these criminals rather than simply wait for a complaint to be made, because both members of the party, both the dealer and the seller, are engaging in something consensual. It's illegal for both, and neither one are going to report the other. And so police have to be proactive in a way that they don't for other crimes. Because they have this decision to make as to where to spend resources and which neighborhoods to police, that's where there's this enormous opportunity for a disparity to emerge in the way that blacks are treated as compared to whites. And all of this is one of the chief mechanisms behind what became known as mass incarceration. And you can see in this chart that if you track how many people are being incarcerated in the United States, it is more than who are incarcerated in Russia, in China, and other totalitarian regimes in the world. We are the number one, virtually the number one country that incarcerates individuals. And you can see that steep incline that began when the war on drugs was launched and has really persisted to this day. In 2012, you can start to see the makings of what looks like a precipitous decline. But as you can see, even by 2016, 2018 in this chart, it hasn't dropped very much. And while mass incarceration has really been responsible for sweeping up a lot of whites and blacks and Latinos and Asians, I mean, people of all races have been swept into the system of incarceration in the United States, it has been particularly unfair to blacks. You can see here in just a simple chart that blacks constituted 32.9% of all prisoners in state and federal prisons. Again, despite having only about 13% of the total population of the United States. Drawing from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, one researcher estimated that in 2001, if you were born a man, you had about a 1 in 9 chance of being imprisoned within your lifetime. But that statistic hides the racial disparity. If you're a white man, your chance of being incarcerated is only about 1 in 17. If you're a black man, your chance is about 1 in 3. If you're Latino, the chances of being incarcerated are about 1 in 6. Women are less likely to be incarcerated, 1 in 56 of all women. But again, we see racial disparities. White women, 1 in 111, black women, about 1 in 18, and Latina women, about 1 in 45. And so while the problem is mass incarceration, one of the other problems is the disparity between black and brown folks in incarceration. And this matters in a number of ways, but as I discussed in the last video, there is this kind of interinstitutional coordination that's happening, which is why you can think about it as a systematic problem. Now follow me on this. Recall that I said that voter registration rolls are used as one of the lists, and sometimes the only list, from which names are drawn for jury duty. And so one of the problems of the criminal justice system is that black defendants are often being judged by a jury of white men and women. And the idea here is that they're not getting a fair trial because these white men and women may bring into the jury box some kind of a racial animus. And as we saw with implicit bias, that's not far off the mark. But consider that once you get convicted of a crime and you're incarcerated, that you will face the likelihood of felony disenfranchisement, so that when you're released, even after you're released, in some states, you're still not able to vote. So in short, what you have is a system where the institution of democracy and the voter registration and all the blocks in making sure that blacks have a hard time getting on that registry, that then feeds into the criminal justice system. It's important to realize that that goes in the reverse order too. The criminal justice system is used as a way to limit the participation of black and brown folks in the institution of democracy. And in fact, in a 2016 paper written by sociologist Christopher Eugen and his colleagues, estimate that African Americans have about a 7.44% rate of felony disenfranchisement, whereas non-African Americans basically everybody else is only disenfranchised at a rate of about 2.47%. So wrapping up, I just want to make two further points. I think we need to ask the question of why is it important to understand how race is defined, as I did in that last video. And if you forget how I talked about it being socially constructed, be sure to check that out. Basically, if there's no inherent or biological reason relegating Black and brown Americans as a permanent underclass, driving them to be the ones who are stopped, searched, arrested, killed more often, less likely to be released on bail, to have longer sentences, to have harsher sentences, higher rates of incarceration and recidivism, disenfranchised more often. If all of these empirical outcomes are symptoms of a problematic system and not problematic people in their biology, then it's incumbent on all of us, but especially on public safety officials, to interrogate the role they personally play in perpetuating these outcomes. That's not to say that any single individual can overcome systemic racism, or that they can, by changing individual habits or ways of seeing, that they can single-handedly overcome the power of the institution that employs them. But it also means that their work, that the actions that they take as individuals can add up to something. And that for each one of us, there is something that we can do. What can be done against systematic racism? And this is tough, right? I mean, this is the question I think that I want to leave you with, because it's something that you need to think about, and it's fundamentally an ethics question. By definition, implicit biases are difficult to spot within ourselves, making them difficult to curtail. We can't change what we can't see within ourselves. But it's also the case that human beings are not robots. We're not simply executing the code of some kind of overlord computer programmer. That may seem obvious, but I think sometimes people forget that we are all capable of making tough decisions. And ethical decision-making is always tough, right? It's never the easy thing to do. That's almost what makes it ethical. We are decision-making beings, and although we may loathe to change old habits, we have the capacity to reflect on situations and act differently. The ethical question is, how does one oppose racism while working within a racist system? I have thoughts on this, but there is no one answer. And in the United States, we have tens of thousands of different police organizations, and all of those have different problems to wrestle with. Some are common, but that the answer to that question might look a little bit different depending on which organization. And so that is my challenge. I want to send you off from this video to think about how it is that individuals can act differently to be anti-racist within racist institutions.